Imagine a world in which nothing and no one ever died. It's impossible, isn't it? Physical death and dying are a necessary part of this world that God has created and which we inhabit. Dying vegetation and dying animals give new life to others in their turn. Have you ever walked through a wood in autumn and noticed the weird and wonderful fungi growing on the decaying tree stumps, or pushing their way through the piles of autumn leaves that are slowly disintegrating back into the rich earth? Fungi such as these depend on death, not only for their own life cycle, but to enable the life of others as they break down the leathery dead leaves into rich, black, life-giving leaf mould, which enriches the soil and feeds the tree's new growth in spring. In an autumn wood, we see in microcosm what needs to happen to all life. Death transformed anew as physical substance is reabsorbed into the creative potential of the earth. Endings give rise to new life and new beginnings. But such deaths in microcosm happen in our own lives too. As the dead leaves nourish the tree from which they fell, so letting go of what is past in our lives can nourish us too. It's not always as radical as death, as endings come in many shapes and guises, but we need to recognise these endings and say goodbye to things, so that we too can continue to grow. Some people find praying the examen a useful exercise before they go to bed. In a quiet space, they come into God's presence and reflect prayerfully on all that has occurred during the day. This is a space for recognising what has passed, rejoicing in the good and lamenting the bad, but ultimately letting it go and committing it into God's care while they sleep. It's a daily routine that in a way anticipates those final prayers which we may expect to say at the end of our lives, and which are echoed in the words of Simeon that we say in our evening or night prayers. Lord, now let your servant depart in peace, according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all peoples. But the departure into sleep at the end of the day is not the only time to reflect on endings. Winter, as the days draw in and the nights get longer, is the night time of the year. Unlike much of the rest of the natural world heading for hibernation or dormancy, we do not look to sleep, but it is nonetheless a good time to reflect on the year that is past and the endings it has seen, even as we reflect on the past day each evening. What have you said goodbye to this year? It might be something major, a house move or a change of job, or it might be smaller, a hobby you no longer have time for. Perhaps there's something you've chosen to let go of, a habit or a practice which no longer gives you life in the way it used to and has gone to make way for something else. Perhaps you've had to let go of something unwillingly, maybe even following a long struggle. Our circumstances change, and it can be a wrench to leave behind something we enjoy when we no longer have time for it, or when we can no longer afford it. It's important to recognise these losses for what they are, little deaths in our lives and in the people we once were. If we can acknowledge them as such, then perhaps we can also make space for new life in their place, because in that new life lie the seeds of our growth. I'm not good at letting things go. My house is full of photographs of people I once knew, souvenirs from places I've lived, objects that belong to my parents and to my childhood. I'm particularly attached to books. Every so often I tell myself that I must not buy any more until I've got rid of some of the old ones. It is hard. These are old friends. I remember buying or being given them, of immersing myself in them and escaping briefly the reality of the daily grind. In sending a book out of my life, I feel as though I am getting rid of a part of me. But when it's done and they've been packed off to the charity shop for a new life giving pleasure to another reader, there is a feeling of lightness. The empty shelves are ready to be refilled. There is space for discovery of new friends, new worlds, space for growth. Letting go makes room for welcoming in. Of course, sometimes letting go is not within our control, and we are forced against our will to confront loss. Perhaps this year you have lost someone close to you. The death of a person can leave us struggling to come to terms not only with the end of them as we knew them, but also with the end of our relationship with them. We mourn the loss of them in so many ways, the loss of their potential, and also the loss of what they meant to us. We feel diminished by them no longer being present in our lives. The death of someone close to us is more than a single ending. It is a mass of holes perforating through our lives. Unlike my empty bookshelves, the spaces they leave cannot easily be filled. Advent, as a time when we traditionally think about endings and beginnings, is a time when these losses can feel particularly raw as Christmas approaches and we steel ourselves to encounter the space at the table for the first, second, or even 20th time. Not all loss can be neatly packaged and dealt with all at once. The tree may fall in the woods and the fungi may begin to colonize it, but it doesn't disappear overnight. It changes shape, darkens, gradually subsides into the contours of the forest floor as plants grow over it and creatures find their home in it. Even as it brings new life for some, we still mourn the loss of its leafy summer canopy and spring blossom, and we must still find a way of navigating this change in the landscape of our lives. And so we do not leave them behind completely, but carry their memory with us, gradually recognizing the change in our relationship to those whose life has ended, even as we ourselves change and renewed. One of the biggest challenges thoughts of death can bring is confrontation with our own mortality. I remember being on a retreat when we were asked to write our own epitaphs. How do we want to be remembered? And does the fact of our eventual death affect the way we live our lives? For those who have bucket lists of things which they want to do before they kick the bucket, it seems as though death is something to be held off by action, a spur to target setting and further achievement. The final reality of death is here acknowledged by a determination to live life in all its fullness and experience all that this world has to offer before it comes to an end and is taken from us. But for Christians, death is not an end. Life in all its fullness is not something we achieve by our own frantic activities, but a gift from God that comes to us freely with God's grace. Death is not a cut-off point, but a staging post on a journey that began before our birth, as God formed us in the womb and calls us by name into life. In many churches, our pastoral liturgies around death reflect this. There are prayers to be said with the dying to prepare them and us for their departure. There are prayers to be said before the funeral, as the dead person makes their last journey on this earth to grave or crematorium. And there is the final farewell, which takes the form not of an ending, but of a commendation to God as their journey continues. We saw this played out very visibly earlier this year as the late Queen travelled from Scotland to Westminster Hall, to the Abbey, and finally to Windsor, where her earthly body reached its final resting place, and she herself was commended to God's care. How can we make our journeys through life part of this longer journey, in which the goal is God? Perhaps if we recognise that our death is only a stage on this journey, then we will feel less compelled to achieve and to do, and more just to be, to live our lives in God's presence, and let all we do flow from that, rather than from a sense of obligation to tick off lists, to judge ourselves harshly when we fail to cram 25 hours of activities into a 24-hour day. To see our lives as journeys in which we pass through a series of spaces and times, constantly saying farewell to those aspects of life which draw to an end or pass from us, even as God draws us into new ones. That sense of movement through time is a driving force through Advent, when our reflection on the last things, death, judgment, heaven, hell, endings and beginnings, is all part of preparation for Christmas, that great feast of incarnation, God with us, Emmanuel. For Christmas is not an ending but a beginning, just as Advent is not the end of the year for Christians but the start of a new year. And Advent calls us to keep on journeying, to set out afresh, bidding farewell to the past we leave behind us, and looking to the future, a future in which the incarnate Christ again takes centre stage in our lives and renews us by his presence as we journey with and towards him. Amen.